All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the inaugural Notre Dame Graduate Conference in Political Theory and Constitutional Studies. We'd like to thank the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government for co-sponsoring the event today, and also welcome those of us who are joining on live stream. We've had 3 excellent sessions this morning with our visiting graduate student presenters and are looking forward to 2 more geared toward law and constitutionalism this afternoon. More information on the conference can be found in our program distributed throughout the room. It is my great honor to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Bryan Garsten, Professor of Political Science and Humanities at Yale. His talk today is titled A Liberalism of Refuge. Please join me in giving Dr. Garsten a warm welcome.
Well, hello and thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here at this inaugural graduate student conference. I want to say thanks first to Professor Eileen Hunt and to Tyler and Emma for all the work they've done, to Evie for picking me up and hosting me so well, and to everyone for having me. I'm here to talk about, I'm afraid, liberalism. That is, I'm here to offer an entry in the great liberalism debates. But let me say first that I was drawn into political theory, as maybe some of you were, by a sense that some political theorists were articulating some deep cause of the ills of our social world. I found that things seemed not to be right, to say that in a very general way, and there was a sense that perhaps the cause of the world being out of kilter lay somehow in liberalism. And that was really a driving intellectual interest for a long time. But I discovered at some point that actually that diagnosis put me in a tradition, that there was a history to that diagnosis. That in fact, liberalism turned into an ism, had been invented, you could say, as an accusation, especially by the Spanish supporters of King Ferdinand, who were fighting to protect the Catholic throne against revolutionary forces early in the 19th century. There were a series of political and papal pronouncements against liberals, identifying them as belonging to a new and dangerous sect. And in naming a set of positions liberalism, the critics meant to place those positions alongside religious errors such as Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anabaptism. Isms were in general names of heresies. Recently, political theorists and at least one politician have suggested that liberal theories, because they allow us to hope we can improve ourselves and our societies, fall into the ancient heresy of Pelagianism, which rejects the concept of original sin. And often our way of speaking about liberalism goes further, characterizing it not merely as heretical, but as, in a strict sense, demonic. Demons, as they appeared in the thought of earlier ages, were kind of shadowy forces that could not be brought into sharp focus, but that had a dangerous vitality and agency, and that explained the bad in the world. And this is how liberalism functions in the discourse of many who are writing today, alongside other isms, other demons, racism, imperialism, and capitalism, for those on the left, or individualism, secularism, and increasingly capitalism, again, for those on the right. And the current analysis of liberalism takes on the character of a kind of demonology, insofar as it attributes to the phenomenon, to liberalism, the characteristics of occult forces. That is, we tend to talk about liberalism sometimes as a pernicious agency that is located everywhere in our societies and yet nowhere in particular, shape-shifting in its form and definition. Now, these are a set of caricatures, we could say, and I want to respond to them today, even though I want to say at the beginning, I share many of the concerns that have been raised about a set of social contract theories associated with a history of liberal thought. And I've written, and my first book was in fact a sort of a criticism of those theories as not theorizing well the practice of political controversy. Others have responded to these caricatures recently too. So Michael Walzer has recently proposed that the word liberal functions best not as an ism, but as an adjective. I agree, but I want to offer a sharper, more political sense of what that adjective, liberal, might mean than Walzer does. In his telling, the adjective liberal refers to a certain manner of putting our opinions into practice, or as he says, how we enact our ideological commitments. Liberals, in his view, are not fanatics. They don't expect to win every argument or every election. They can recognize the sincerity of their rivals, even when they don't agree with them. And it seems to me certainly that those observations capture some recognizable features of liberal society, of a liberal way of conducting oneself in politics. But I also worry that that way of speaking can convey the impression that what it is to be liberal is really to be fundamentally a kind of moralist who prefers a genteel style of politics in which we agree to refrain from pressing our case too far. The attraction of liberal politics understood in that way will not be apparent to people who don't identify with or feel respect for the gentility of their day, people who feel instead that they do need to press their case uncompromisingly to make headway against an intransigent, often liberal elite. I want to say that the crucial starting point for liberals can be a set of fundamental recurring problems that often rise in different forms of political life. So let me speak just very broadly about those problems. Human beings living together tend to fall into relatively closed groups and to enforce the norms of those groups in quiet but often unforgiving ways. Most of us, most of the time, are docile, but we can be brought occasionally to erupt into furious, fanatical violence against anyone who strays from our conventions. And we're usually brought to that boiling point by the incitement of some politician, preacher, or military man as a part of the more or less constant jousting that takes place among the most ambitious individuals out there, those whom Machiavelli calls princes or aspiring princes. And the rest of us, liberals often think, tend to be at their mercy. Liberals, at their best, try to reduce our vulnerability to these political entrepreneurs. The liberal values of choice and consent, mobility, the values that support institutional pluralism and commercial society, those values are meant to respond to and mitigate that particular vulnerability, I want to say. Liberal societies, I want to suggest, are those that offer refuge from the very people that they empower. Refuge from the very people they empower. And the reach of that formulation is what I want to try to work out a little bit today. And the reach becomes evident when we allow ourselves to use refuge in both a literal and a metaphorical sense, so that institutions and practices can offer a refuge of a kind, just as much as a fortress could. Historically, a monarchy empowers a king or a queen or a royal family. A monarchy could be liberal if it also included a parliament or a class of nobles who had real power of some kind, so that a citizen who fell out of the king's good graces at the moment could take refuge, to a certain extent, under the protection of this or that aristocrat or constituency. So the 18th century French writer Montesquieu emphasized that idea when distinguishing monarchy from despotism. Analogously, a democracy empowers the people, you could say, or, in truth, those who can persuasively claim to speak or act for the people, for the majority. It's only a liberal democracy if it also offers refuge from those same leaders and their partisans. There may be no resisting the majority in the long term, as Tocqueville seems to have thought, But in a liberal democracy, one should be able to find a host of power centers outside the centralized state authority that would offer significant shelter from whatever version of popular sovereignty is reigning at a particular moment. So a monarchy empowers monarchs but offers some shelter from them. A democracy empowers the people or the majority but offers some shelter from them. A religion empowers people too. Priests, most obviously. A religion is liberal if it also offers refuge from its leaders. Clergy may still serve for most religious people as authoritative guides through life's key moments. But abuses by priests are not unknown. A liberal religion allows for other sects, denominations, or congregations, or for direct access to the sacred books themselves, or ultimately for deference to one's own conscience, all of which may be considered as metaphorical places of refuge from the very people a religion empowers. Now, because liberal societies offer within them different sorts of refuge, they shouldn't produce many refugees fleeing elsewhere. So the United States does not generally produce large refugee flows fleeing outwards. But those it has at times produced, such as when enslaved Americans fled to Canada before the American Civil War, have offered good indices of weaknesses in the liberal credentials of the United States. Liberal societies themselves should, by their nature, appreciate the plight of foreign refugees, I think, and err on the side of welcoming them when possible. But the facts don't allow us to say that liberal societies are always more welcoming than non-liberal societies to foreign refugees. Here, my point is the crucial indicator of liberalism is whether a society produces refugees. A society becomes more liberal when it reduces the reasons that people have to flee, not by converting everyone inside to one outlook or identity, but by offering them the chance to find refuge internally. So liberal societies aim to generate no exodus from them. The notion of refuge, it seems to me, has been left out of most recent debates about liberalism, but I think it deserves more attention. The other concepts usually highlighted, such as rights, private property, trade, pluralism, those concepts lose some of their moral urgency, I think, their purpose, if we forget their links to refuge. Refuge is a form of liberty that liberals should care about, and it's the one, I'm going to argue, that most obviously ennobles the liberal project. And furthermore, I want to say that refuge is a political value that many of today's populists should appreciate. Populists are sometimes right to worry about the dominance of meritocratic elites in the West. But that concern should lead populists to double down on liberal strategies to manage elites and ensure that no one group of them can dominate. I want to clarify that liberal as an adjective in political life should not be identified with the demand that the people being ruled compromise when it comes to matters of justice, as is sometimes suggested in the attempts. Rather, it's the rulers who must accept limitations on their power. The early 19th century French writer, Benjamin Constant, made the key point in his Principles of Politics, which urged readers to focus less on the form of government, monarchy or republic, and more on the amount of authority given to the ruler. So, one exemplary quote, entrust unlimited authority to one man, to several, to all, and you will still find that it is equally an evil. And Constant himself worked to liberalize both the post-revolutionary French Republic and Napoleon's revived monarchy. The problem that he identified with illiberal rule in both regimes was, in his words, there's no means of sheltering individuals from governments. So in trying to understand the essential character of the liberal modification of rule, we would do well to focus on this idea of sheltering, I think. Though, I want to clarify, it's not only governments we need to shelter from. Liberal governments can also provide shelter from private rulers of various kinds. That refuge can be found from the domination of a ruler or authority does not imply, as both liberals and their critics are sometimes tempted to suggest, that the rulers in liberal societies do not rule. They do. Perhaps sometimes the countervailing powers that liberals prize might successfully challenge the reigning administration or government. But it's an overstatement to suggest that the back and forth of political controversy among power centers in civil society eliminates or diffuses rule so much that it becomes mere governance. In liberal societies, as in any other, we are ruled by the people who hold key positions in the state and in private life and the economy. And I think liberals should not pretend they can satisfy a general desire not to be ruled at all. That desire, which slides towards libertarianism or anarchism, will never find satisfaction in political life. But the desire to be free of rule altogether should be distinguished, I want to say, from the desire to escape particular abuses, which surge. That desire to escape particular abuses surges with special legitimacy at certain moments. It's an episodic desire. When we find ourselves in danger of being crushed by the battles for glory or influence among the ambitious people who tend to cause the most damage. Now, in modern democracies and democratic theory, rulers often justify their rule with claims to represent the majority. Democracy through representatives or assemblies of active citizens brings many benefits, but it does not protect against the dangers that liberals emphasize. We should not mistake even the cleanest elections or the most participatory assemblies, which assuage our general discomfort with the idea of being ruled. We should not mistake them for meaningful offers of refuge backed by institutional design and political power. So ruling is done in a liberal way, not when it is cloaked in the language of popular sovereignty, but when it is offset by real offers of refuge. Those offers can be found in rival political parties and separated powers such as courts and executive agencies, in a reasonable degree of autonomy for local communities, and a powerful civil society organization such as churches, mosques and synagogues, universities, media companies, labor unions, corporations. Tocqueville told a story in a footnote to his discussion of tyranny of the majority in the United States of journalists in Baltimore who opposed the War of 1812 when it was very popular. A mob attacked the offices of the Federal Republican newspaper, breaking the paper's presses, forcing the newspapermen into jail cells, and killing one of them. And the murderers were brought to trial, but acquitted by a jury. And Tocqueville's point in raising this example and telling the story was that American politics in that moment was democratic but not liberal, because it offered no refuge from the power of the people claiming to act for the majority. Public opinion, the legislatures, the executive power, the armed forces, and police, jury trials, ultimately, all found their authority in the same power, the majority, and so none could offer effective protection from that power. Tocqueville saw in that situation, quote, the lack of a guarantee against tyranny. By guarantee, he meant some institution or authority with enough power to protect against the sovereign majority in that moment. To clarify, a guarantee of that kind is not an alternative ruler. It's someone to turn to for protection against the ruler. The pattern of thought comes from monarchic times. Again, Montesquieu argued that the French nobles, clergy, and parliaments, intermediary and subordinate powers, were undoubtedly beneath the monarch in power and prestige, but could still effectively play a sheltering role and prevent the king from becoming a despot. And Tocqueville hoped that associations could play a functionally equivalent role in democratic settings. He thought associations were the only forces powerful enough and legitimate enough to stand up against a central state authority ruling with the alibi of democratic elections. The distinctiveness of Tocqueville's argument for association lies partly in his idea that these associations could be politically crucial even if they did not claim any part of sovereignty. So that's the basic perspective I want to put out there. Now I'd like to think about how certain familiar topics of debate about liberalism look from this perspective. So let's take commerce and markets. Liberals are often criticized for their commitment to capitalism and the values of commercial society, such as free trade. This commitment, too, and I want to say its proper scope, can be better understood if we remind ourselves of its link to the project of offering refuge. So we tend to think of the economy too often as a purely natural domain, perhaps even one that exists prior to politics. But the modern economy, at least, which relies on a market for labor and on rights and contracts enforced by governments, was conceived in the 18th century as a political project with its own goals. Economic growth, the alleviation of poverty, the softening of cultural habits away from war, the reduction of religious violence, all of these were among the ambitions of capitalism's early defenders. Less often noted, but equally important, was this objective of freeing wealth and value from its entrenchment in land and landed families, making value more mobile, to allow people to protect value from the depredations of the powerful. So I'm going to go back to Montesquieu again here. Montesquieu highlighted this function of commerce when he explained how commerce had spread throughout Europe in the Middle Ages. Finance, he noted, had been condemned in medieval Christian societies. Only people beneath contempt, the Jews, he meant, were permitted to handle banking. When European princes noticed that the bankers had become rich, however, they tried to seize the wealth, and in response, recounted Montesquieu, his words now, the Jews, proscribed in each country in turn, found the means for saving their effects. In that way, they managed to fix their refuges forever. They invented letters of exchange, and in this way, commerce was able to avoid violence and maintain itself everywhere, for the richest trader had only invisible goods which could be sent everywhere and leave no trace anywhere. Now, the story reinforced an already familiar anti-Jewish association between that oppressed minority and money. But in Montesquieu's version, there was also plenty of admiration for the political innovation here. The key theoretical point was to understand commerce as flight from sovereign political authority, capital as refuge from despotic rule. In a short chapter titled On Peoples Who Have Engaged in Economic Commerce, Montesquieu put forward a synecdoche for commercial society, a portrait of the coastal French city of Marseille as, in his words, a necessary retreat in the midst of a stormy sea, whose barrenness forced the refugees who landed there to live by trading rather than farming. And the example of Marseille was meant to suggest a more general conclusion. Here's Montesquieu's conclusion. It has been seen everywhere that violence and harassment have brought forth economic commerce among men who are constrained to hide in marshes, on islands, on the shoals, and even among dangerous reefs. Thus, where Tyre, Venice, and the Dutch towns founded, fugitives found security there. They had to live. They drew their livelihood from the whole universe. Now, some readers see in that description an indictment of the liberal spirit. If the germ of commercial society is flight to safety, then capitalism can seem at its heart to be nothing but a frightened escape, the avoidance of an evil maybe, but not a positive political vision of its own. But that reading of the passage, it eventually came to seem to me, fails to register Montesquieu's own observation that seeking refuge led to the founding of cities. To be sure, he noticed those cities were different in character from cities based on victory in war or on a shared project of spiritual ascension. Nevertheless, Tyre, Venice, and the Dutch towns were not merely temporary settlements. They were meant to be new forms of political life. And their most distinctive trait was that they drew their livelihood from the whole universe. That is, they were by necessity open to the influx of goods and people from elsewhere. Once established, these cities were no longer in the process of escape, no longer seeking refuge. They were offering refuge. That offer, I want to say, is the moral core of liberal societies. Now, it's important to notice that if commerce is a dominant activity within these cities, and not just a brief facilitator of their founding, then the mobility of value characteristic of commerce will be an important feature in the social life established in such societies. And mobility means, first of all, the possibility of exit, not just from the country as a whole, but throughout one's social existence, leaving behind a particular job as opposed to being stuck in a lifelong dependency or guilt, leaving behind a particular inheritance as opposed to relying on rents from family land, leaving behind a particular place or a particular house of worship. The possibility of exit from these and other social positions is a necessary condition of the spread of this way of life. And the benefit of that possibility can be felt by acknowledging how common it is for each of these different domains in social life to fall under the despotic reign of local lords of one kind or another. In each domain, then, we can become refugees of a kind, leaving behind an inherited or previously chosen situation to see if we can find or found something better. Commercial society aims to be generally hospitable to these ventures, even with the uncertainties, risks, and dislocations they bring. Now, emphasizing this political function of commerce might help to answer a challenge that's often put to liberals from both right and left. Do liberals provide any criterion for judging how much accumulation, how much commodification or marketization, how much trade is appropriate? One view is that liberals simply value liberty and abstract freedom, and therefore that they easily fall into rationalizing unprincipled, unrestrained accumulation and inequality. But if a fundamental liberal purpose of commercial society, with its associated notions of private property, trade, and finance, is to offer refuge in these various ways, to prevent sovereigns, princes, and local despots of all kinds from having full control over human value, then we should be able to use that purpose, that end, to evaluate the proper extent of commercial activity in particular moments and situations. This way of thinking may, in fact, at times allow a significant amount of accumulation of private wealth, since it takes substantial capital to offer meaningful refuge from the astonishing concentrations of wealth and power in modern states. But this way of thinking should be equally concerned about the enormous concentrations of power in modern corporations in the modern economy, entities which have obviously become political lions, to use John Locke's metaphor, at least as dangerous as states from which we need refuge. So this liberal view looks to produce some sort of dynamic balancing among these kinds of beasts, state and corporate, so that the rest of us have the best chance of finding shelter from any one of them under the protection of some other. A liberal capitalism is suspicious of monopolies, both private and public. So the market economy, as we know it, was invented as a liberal modification of political rule, designed to make it easier for us to seek, find, and create refuges from the dominance of the most ambitious and imposing individuals, the aspiring princes of the modern world. The market's liberal legitimacy disappears if it forgets that role and produces new princes from whom we can find no shelter. All right, now, critics may say, this talk of refuge is just slightly different language for the lust for emancipation that liberals always glorify, and that tends to dissolve all the inherited goods of human life. What is to keep us from wanting refuge from ordinary moral obligations and communal responsibilities? Will the offer of refuge, just as much as the promise of liberation, not lure us away from the truest sources of meaning and happiness in life, from our families, our co-workers, our hometowns, our churches, synagogues, mosques? Will it not draw us, the critic might continue, into elite universities where we are doomed to discover the moral and spiritual emptiness and frivolity of modern life? And to take the critique to its furthest extent, will this not risk leading modern individuals into the lonely rootlessness that makes us a part of the masses, ripe for recruitment by a demagogue into some new totalitarian dream? It seems to me now that the presumption in these worries is that the mere availability of refuges weakens all our attachments, That, for example, alternate forms and places of worship weaken our commitment to our own. Or, in an example important in the history of liberal thought, the idea that the legal option of divorce weakens our commitment to our marriages. The possibility of exit is presumed to encourage, as your own wonderful theorist Patrick Deneen puts it, loose connections, an open and superficial marketplace in every domain of social and political life, with no criteria to guide us in choices about whether to exit or where to go, except the empty formality of an autonomous will or the lure of an ideal of the self-fashioning, expressive individual for whom there are no truly hard choices, but only different lifestyle options. The possibility of leaving, looming in our imagination, is said to remove from us any capacity for self-restraint, to lure us from any truly political forms of life into an anti-culture of merely transactional individualism, leaving us floating carelessly among fleeting alliances. So I think foregrounding the offer of refuge in liberal thought helps to reveal at least a gap in that argument, in that set of worries. It forces critics who are worried about those things to move more slowly and to explain more precisely how the mere availability of shelter outside our inherited communities tends to dissolve those communities and turn us into our most selfish and superficial selves. Focusing on refuge reminds us that choice and consent are meant to be escape hatches rather than constitutive foundations on their own. It's an obvious fact that liberals do not actively steal people away from their marriages or their churches. They simply offer the chance to find or build the life outside of them. So the question is, why is that offer alone thought to be so corrosive? The anti-liberal worry seems to rest on a logic of temptation. The reason the critic doubts we can be trusted to discern the difference between, on the one hand, escaping a particularly violent, oppressive, or stultifying situation, and, on the other, shirking responsibilities and pursuing every passing pleasure, the reason must be that it is too tempting to use the specter of oppression as an excuse to indulge our least worthy impulses. The logic of temptation posits that if offered the chance, we will not be able to resist the invitation to characterize every constraint on desire as an unjust one. Even ordinary parts of life, subjection to the authority of a parent, a teacher, a minister, responsibilities to a spouse, children, or neighbors, will be dismissed as threats from which we could or should find refuge. And the temptation will often be more powerful in us than the love of what we have and what we know. The idea seems to be that liberals amplify the voices inside our heads that we should least trust, those demons tempting us into dreams of unlimited freedom. The worry seems to be that we're naturally inclined to evil. The doctrine of original sin seems to lurk here. The logic of temptation betrays a view about human sociability. It suggests that we stay in moral, religious, and political communities, not by nature or natural tendency, but only if there's no other option calling to us. As soon as a window is opened, we tend to scatter into the air like sand in the wind. Now notice that this is precisely the reverse of the usual view about the anthropological assumptions behind liberalism. The anti-liberals seem to be the ones who think that humans are spontaneously, naturally individualistic. That is why we can't be given the chance to choose. The liberals are the ones who think that individuals are naturally and spontaneously social. That is, that we will mostly tend to stay in place in our communities and pursue our lives much as we always have, unless pressed by necessity. Even John Locke, the patron saint of liberals, presumed that revolution would be rare because people are not so easily got out of their old forms as some are apt to suggest. And when, as the United States founders put it in the Declaration of Independence, a long train of abuses and usurpations does press us to seek refuge, liberals are the ones who assume that we will, in relatively short order, start the work of producing new communities, new families, new associations, even new religious orders, as humans seem to have done at every time and place that we know of. Liberals are the ones who seem to think, with Aristotle, that in that sense we are political animals. So if forced to answer a question that's often posed in one form or another about sort of the foundations, the theoretical foundations of liberalism, I would be wary of the ism, but I would also answer, at least for the sake of provoking another round of discussion, that the foundations include the belief that human beings are naturally political in the sense that we naturally tend to live in communities, need them to flourish, and to regenerate them. That in most communities, a small number of ambitious warriors, strongmen, prophets, and demagogues tend to rise up and compete with one another for rule, leaving the rest of us at their mercy and threatening us with despotism of different kinds. And among the assumptions or foundations, that if we're forced by those circumstances into exile, we are capable of building new communities that can support us in the ways we need to live well. That last presumption, or matter of faith, that communities of this kind can be ethically fulfilling and can satisfy our ambition for something high even and noble, that last point seems to require special defense today. So let me, in the last part of my talk, say something about that. A strange notion seems to have recently arisen in, I'll use Matisse's word, decadent, or Nietzsche's word, decadent but influential pockets of online discussion. A strange notion seems to have arisen that tyrannical politics, clerical authority, and paramilitary battle even offer the only real opportunities to display vitality and strength in a Western world overwhelmed by the boredom of bourgeois life and the superficiality of consumer culture. The notion seems strange to me because people who've spent time in actual religious or military autocracies report that they tend to be places of subservience, duplicity, betrayal, lassitude, and selfishness. Where then does the nostalgia for illiberal societies come from? It arises partly, I think, as a legitimately moral protest, a sense of disgust with the supposed weakness and selfishness that we see so much in liberal societies. Young men, in particular, conscious of their strength, looking for a worthy use for it, can develop a contempt for liberal societies if they view them as merely protection for the weak and afraid, and perhaps the inferior. When the political theorist Judith Shklar wrote an essay called The Liberalism of Fear shortly before the end of the Cold War, she meant to argue for the priority of working against obvious evils such as cruelty and torture. And I have enormous respect for the hardened voice of historical experience in her essay. But I do sometimes think she conceded too much to the idea that liberals had to be anti-utopians. She declined to take seriously the human need to devote ourselves to something high. She dismissed critics of liberal society who worried that the scramble for safety and comfort alone can debase us. I think those critics are not wrong to worry. Instead of dismissing them, liberals should put forward a different idea of what strength and nobility look like. Instead of focusing on flight and the seeking of refuge, they should highlight the particular sort of nobility that can be found in the work of offering refuge. The vision of a society that would offer refuge from injustice and oppression elsewhere in the world was obviously historically central to founding era hopes for the United States. And the American revolutionaries were inspired, of course, partly by Locke, who wrote of the common refuge from force and violence that could be found in dissolving the existing government in a revolution. And there are other examples throughout early American history. There are even towns in the United States named Asylum, and so on. And this vision of the purpose of the United States as a liberal society took on new importance in the next century. And here I'm going to turn, I admit, with some embarrassment, although I'm not sure why, to a very famous few lines from the 1883 poem by Emma Lazarus, which is inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. Those lines have become a cliche. But it's too bad, because the poem, especially prior to the most famous lines, specifically addresses this problem. That is, the poem aims to suggest an alternative to the closed, warlike ancient city, whose only heroism can be found in conquest. The poem suggests a different kind of heroism. So the poem is the new Colossus. Listen to the beginning. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. And then give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Now, Emma Lazarus's poetry was influenced by the time she spent with Jewish refugees who had fled a wave of pogroms in Russia. She did not think, though, that a safer location alone would be enough for the refugees. They needed a new mode of political life oriented around new sorts of heroes. The Statue of Liberty itself had been conceived by the French scholar Edouard de Laboulaye in France, a Collège de France expert on the United States and its Constitution. Laboulaye was also an expert on Benjamin Constant's liberal thought and had put together a major new edition of Constant's political writings for publication, all because Laboulaye seemed to hope that strengthening the sense of a shared mission between France and a post-Civil War, post-slavery United States would help to revive Constant's liberal approach to politics and, here's the point here, and to wean the French off the nostalgia for martial greatness that had led them to go along with Napoleon II's Second Empire. Both the Statue of Liberty and the poem at its base, that is, focus attention not on retreat, escape, or flight, but on arrival and on what can be built by those who arrive. They glorify welcome, the offer of refuge, rather than the pursuit of it. Pursued, refuge can seem a matter of necessity rather than an aspirational good. It's an escape from fear, and therefore can seem like a good of the weak. But offered, refuge appears in a different light, I think, as evidence of generosity, hospitality, magnanimity. Extending refuge is something one can only do from a position of strength, of relative superiority even. This is not natural superiority, which is incompatible with democracy, but a superiority of situation, fortune, and inclination. These examples focus on offering refuge to people from elsewhere, but as I have emphasized, liberal societies are marked even more clearly by their internal offers of refuge to their own members. And that, too, was put forth as an ideal early in the history of the United States by its most iconic, heroic figure. George Washington had improbably defeated the strongest empire of his time in war. He could have claimed his status as a brazen giant, a colossus of the old sort, as his basically peer Napoleon would soon do. Instead, Washington self-consciously tried to strengthen a new understanding of heroism. He had raised an army. He had presided over the founding of a nation. He cannot be accused of having thought that isolated or atomized individuals suffice. But he was, without a doubt, a liberal. Notice how Washington described the character of the nation he founded. He consistently prioritized the idea that people would find refuge from the depredations of politics there. If we keep in mind Montesquieu's passage linking the plight of the Jews to the establishment of liberal societies, we can see the significance of a public letter that Washington wrote in 1790 to the Jews of the Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, often said to be the oldest Jewish congregation in America. In the letter, famously, Washington says, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." Washington was there quoting his favorite passage from the Bible, Micah 4:4, a passage he cited throughout his personal correspondence. And the last half of that sentence describes, as well as any passage, the utopian goal of the liberalism of refuge, a goal that would remain far out of reach without the new sort of heroism Washington sought to exemplify. To want to make a society more liberal is not necessarily to set its sights low, but to change its sense of what would ennoble it. I know that certainly in the contemporary academic world, I might be holding myself up for ridicule, daring to take seriously the Statue of Liberty, George Washington, those hoary heroes of the old American idealism. And I do not deny what cannot be denied, their myriad failures in practice. But other frameworks too, Marxist and Catholic, Foucauldian, Fanonian, have also produced disappointment, or worse. In comparing guiding ideals, we should take care not to set the pearls of one against the empty shells of another. If we are to sort among utopias, it must be pearls to pearls. So the liberal modification of rule offers, I think, a vision of its own. So, in highlighting this notion of refuge, I'm really just aiming to look at familiar aspects of liberal societies from a slightly different perspective. Individual choice and consent appear from this perspective not as arbitrary or willful foundations for society, but as escape hatches from the worst parts of political life. Commerce appears as a way to slip out of the hands of the powerful. Constitutional limits on elected legislatures come to light as assurance of temporary shelters from politicians' latest gambles. And pluralistic civil society offers a whole ecosystem of refuges where one can camp out and build the beginnings of something new. Some critics worry that if we're given the choice to flee evils in the many ways that liberalism of refuge would protect, our mobility will turn us into rootless beings. It now seems to me that this concern has been given too much weight since Heidegger and Arendt. It seems to me that we, as human beings, are not trees who flourish when deeply rooted in the soil. We're human beings with legs, meant to explore. What we need to flourish is not roots so much as refuges from which we can venture forth and to which we can retreat. Often we end up returning to where we started with new insight or appreciation, like Odysseus gratefully coming home. But sometimes we do not or cannot return home. And so we begin again and find, I think, in those beginnings, a distinctly liberal adventure, the noble work of building new societies that refugees know so well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Garsten. We'll open it up for some Q&A from the audience. If you want to raise your hand, I'll come to you with the mic. So I'll get Evie first here.
Thank you so much, Professor Garsten. This was very, very interesting and good. I had just a question about, so I thought it was really interesting how you posed that kind of critics of liberalism seem to be the ones who think that man is naturally asocial or independent, and the reverse is true in the other way. But I guess I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about, the current, as the Surgeon General's office has talked about recently, right, like the crisis of social isolation in the United States and loneliness. And I guess if you had some thoughts about what the roots of that might be, you can see statistics that, like compared to, I think in 1990, like 3% of Americans said they didn't have any close friends, and now 12% of Americans say, or maybe it's just one, I can't remember the exact, but just that there has been this like clear rise in people just being very isolated from other humans. And so I guess if you had any thoughts about alternative sources of that to the ones that the critic that you were referring to,
Sure.
might, or also solutions to that in our context.
Good. Well, let me start with the diagnosis of that. I mean, these are worrisome trends. The question is how to understand their cause. So here I'm with, or I'd at least want to think seriously about Tocqueville's diagnosis. Tocqueville sort of anticipates this as one potential problem that arises in modern societies, but his diagnosis is not that it's a product of liberalism. his diagnosis is actually that it's a product of democracy, that a certain understanding of democracy, which he wants to educate, as he says, but a certain understanding of democracy would empower a very authoritative, centralized state in the name of the people. And that would leave each of us feeling relatively weak and isolated in the face of that centralized authority with which we have no very direct connection other than elections. So he wrote that sort of counterintuitively, I think, to us, it's actually democracy under that understanding that produces a sense of powerlessness and individualism amongst us. And so his remedy was to revivify the world between the state and the individual. That is, I mean, this is all very familiar, but the world of associations and civil society. And so I feel I'm not very original in thinking that that is plausible, but I do want to point out that it's a different diagnosis than the recent one, which is that it's liberalism, the offers of refuge, that cause the problem, rather than the empowerment of a centralized state authority justified democratically that is the sort is the root of the problem. And I do want to clarify here that to be skeptical of that understanding, that institutionalization of democracy, is not to be anti-democratic. It's to be skeptical of that a merely plebiscitary democracy, a strong state justified by occasional elections, is a satisfying form of political life, even for Democrats.
Okay, thanks so much, Professor Garsten. I find the idea of refuge very attractive, and I think you provide a great response to sort of critics of liberalism from the right, Nietzschean and religious varieties. But I kind of want to press you from the other side, that is from kind of left-wing skeptics of, if not liberalism per se, the kind of liberalism that you seem to be advocating. And it seems to me that, you know, if you return to Hobhouse's book on liberalism, he says, you know, if the provision of counterpowers is the body of liberalism, the search for individuality or the search for self-creation is the heart of liberalism. And it seems like, you know, even in the thinkers you mention, you know, liberty of the moderns for Constant is liberty for a new kind of person, has certain characteristics. For Montesquieu, you know, the virtue of the ancients who would astonish our small souls is contrasted with the kinds of virtues that the moderns have. And it seems like those people are indeed tolerant, do indeed have a heroism of refuge, but also have kind of other characteristics that I'm not sure the idea of refuge captures. They're ever experimenting, they're radiant individuals, they're eccentric, they are indeed individualistic in some respects, but not just in the bad sense. And I'm just wondering what you think the relationship between that kind of radiant individuality and refuge is. Is it that refuge is its precondition? Is it that refuge matters more? You know, whatever. So that's the first question. Then the second question, more briefly, is about the kind of Foucauldian diagnosis of the history of modern thought and history of liberal thought. And one way to frame it is something like he's tracing the history of liberalism as the transformation of refuge from a shield to a sword, meaning initially a kind of very welcome protection against indeed tyrannies, but now something in the name of which new subtler forms of tyrannies operate. You can think of all sorts of technocratic, bureaucratic, of administrative or managerial forms of domination that use the language, if not the idea of refuge, to exert kinds of dominations upon us. And so, of course, that need not be kind of an argument against your position anyway, because you might simply say that's not real refuge. But I'm wondering what you think about that genealogy and what you think, as someone who thinks that refuge is the key idea, has gone wrong, and what we might do differently this time around if we're seeking to revive that idea. So, thank you.
Yeah, good. Okay, the first question is about, what about developing individuality? So first of all, I think that is, in some ways, a beautiful ideal. And that some people are really drawn to it, but not everyone. And so I think a liberal emphasis on refuge creates an environment in which that is possible, and in some ways even asks for it or produces opportunities for the development of individuality. I'll say more about that in a second. But I think it also attends to the fact that that ideal is not, it's not one that attracts everyone. Some people are more attracted to their fit within a family life that is rich in some way, and the aspiration to individuality of the kind that Mill describes in chapter 3 of On Liberty seems self-indulgent or superficial to them, and a liberal society should have room for both types, is what I would say. Now, I do think that because the offer of exit and refuge for those who exit from any particular social situation is a feature of liberal societies, implicit in that is that liberal societies ask a certain amount of us in terms of self, to use a phrase you were using, I think, self-government or self-rule or self-determination. And that is already to be on the way to an ethic of individuality. I don't think it always leads all the way to a kind of genius or novelty that individuality suggests. But there is a kind of self-rule that's implicit in this notion of liberal society as full of other alternatives. So that's one way in which I think these societies point to that possibility without requiring everyone to follow it or to pursue it. The other thing is that I mentioned at the very end these projects of creating new communities, new religious sects, new places. And that project, I mean, that is the work of founding. And liberal societies are full of opportunities, even demands, for that work. And that is an assertive, creative work that is there for those individuals who are drawn to it, who feel something inside themselves that needs or wants that sort of outlet. And so I do think that this understanding of liberal society, again, it's not merely defensive. It opens the possibility of that work within our society, not requiring the founders to upset our society in order to found something new or to leave it in order to found something new. There's opportunity within civil society for just this sort of work, which I think has some features in common with individuality. On your second question, sorry, I need a quick reminder. Foucault. So look, to be sure, the language of refuge, like any other language, I think, can be weaponized, as we say now, in service of those who want to consolidate power over us, and I'm sure it has been used in that way. Whether the language is particularly prone to abuse in that way, I'd have to be convinced. There are lots of other ideologies and justifications out there that are used to rationalize exertions of power over us. And I'd want to know why this language is particularly liable to be abused that way.
Thank you, Brian. I overstayed my other obligation just so that I can ask you this question.
Oh, boy.
I love this argument, but this time, I think I saw you give a much more truncated version before, so I got the full version this time. And what hit me is that the examples that you use in the last part of your talk are actually not liberal, by which I mean the Lazarus poem is just Pericles' funeral oration, I would say, made American. That is, there's the openness to we define ourselves by throwing our doors open to others. So that's, even though it sets itself against the ancient, I actually think it's like a pretty Athenian sentiment. The Washington example, I mean, I don't want to get flayed for this, but I mean, on your own historical analysis, liberalism as such comes into being only as a kind of demonization of revolutionary impulses in the 19th century. And so Washington himself is not liberal in that sense. And and then you come back to Odysseus too. So the question behind me probing all of your examples is whether or not this virtue of liberality, let's say, is in fact something that cuts deeper than liberalism. That is, that it's saying something about what regimes should offer to human beings that actually might be an argument still kind of against liberalism in its ism sense, as you started the talk. That is, it's still like not quite modern. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Although, so I want to think about each of those. And that's helpful because it forces me to think more carefully about each of those examples. I mean, Pericles' funeral oration does make a virtue of a certain kind of openness that the Athenians had. And that's tied to the fact that Athens was, had a harbor and was more involved in commerce, did not close itself. And this is at least the stylized contrast we get. It did not close itself in quite the way that Sparta did. I would say two things, though. First, there's an ambivalence always in Athens about outsiders. Aristotle famously says it's great that the port was not right in the city, but connected to the city. You had to go down a road, so you could keep the dangerousness of the outsiders at some remove from the center, from the city itself. And Pericles' funeral oration does not make a virtue of the offer of refuge. It makes a virtue of the kind of confidence that is associated with the openness, and maybe of the energy that you get from it, and the kind of ideas and goods coming in from elsewhere in the world. But I don't know that the sort of moral good of offering refuge is, at least as I read the speech, really there. So I'd still say it's not exactly the same. And then on Washington, yes, so I would be careful. So liberalism, no. But the word liberal was used in just the way you used it a moment ago, kind of liberality, generosity. The word liberal was used especially in religious matters as a certain less dogmatic enforcement or stance towards religious requirements. So the word liberal, I think, is fair. And Washington used the word that way in these same contexts. I should probably go find that and put that in there. Yeah. And then, but your more general question was, I think I agree with, in other words, the idea that liberal is best thought of as an adjective means that it can be applied in many different kinds of regimes. And I do want to suggest that that's the case. That is, there could be a liberal socialism, there could be liberal monarchy, there can be more and less liberal forms of religion. And the flip side of that is there can be a sort of dogmatic liberalism, which is not very liberal. And I'm very concerned about that, and think liberals should worry about that as much as they should worry about other forms of dogmatism.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, one point I would add in response to Emma's question with respect to Pericles' use of the term liberality, it's actually a kind of expression of Athenian power, because they're doing favors for friends, and that is a sign that they have the power to do those favors in a way that their beneficiaries do not.
The Statue of Liberty was a gift from France.
Yeah, well,
It's the same, but we can argue about this later.
yeah. I'll just give Emma a couple of glasses of wine, and then maybe I'll win that argument. But I too am very attracted to your account of liberalism as sort of not just a beautiful and beautifying account, but an ennobling account of liberalism, which it's badly in need of, given its critics on both the left and the right, whom I think forget the great gifts that liberalism has provided to all of us, sort of across social class, political class, economic class. But I wonder, and my libertarian impulses also like this idea of the opportunity of exit, the right of exit, as the libertarians. Yeah, but I wonder if you don't do justice to the concerns, not just of people like my colleague Patrick Deneen, but also people on the left, about, even on your own account, how this right of exit or as you put it, opportunity for refuge, leads not just to the problem that allows us to give way to our sort of worst impulses, because there's nothing that ties us to the responsibility of place and others, of our duties. But that in connection with that, it doesn't, it allows us a way out of the hard work of attending to those responsibilities. And so it's, and so much of, modern life is sort of the fostering of convenience and comfort. And so it plays into that set. And it's not just temptations, but just the sort of easiness that it provides for us. And I worry about it in this regard, that as you point out, and I'm very much of your line of thought, one of the great concerns is the ambitious type who will wield power and seek domination over others. And that these opportunities for refuge make others apolitical, that it's not just rootless, but they make them apolitical, and so that they lose the capacity to resist the imposition of power and domination. And that is part of the problem with, a sort of all these of a liberalism of refuge, that we don't actually resist in a deeply political way the imposition of power over us. And then I think the other concern, especially by conservatives on this, is that these new communities that you say these places of refuge allow for, there are better and worse forms of that.
Sure.
And that torn from the tried and true tradition and the rootedness in exactly the intermediary associations that you suggest are also necessary to this liberalism of refuge, that there will be pernicious forms of ways of life and communities that further sort of lead to degradation, human degradation and decline.
Well, look, those are powerful questions, and they're some of the questions that I am most worried about, to be sure. I think I want to emphasize the idea that there's a certain amount of a ruling of ourselves that liberal societies do require. And it may be that it's just very difficult to do that. I mean, we all have trouble even deciding, well, what to eat every day. I'm surprised at the number of emails I've gotten in response to the piece which just came out that mentioned pornography as the plight of young men today. So it may be that it's very difficult to live well, that is, to rule our own psyches. And that's an old theme. Now, I don't think that difficulty comes from a demon called liberalism, because I see the difficulty discussed in Plato, beautiful images of horses pulling us in different directions and so on. And so I think that's a human problem. So then the question is, does having the option to leave an abusive marriage or a tyrannical, despotic sect or polity highlight or intensify this human problem? And there I'm less convinced that it does. I'm not sure that people who live in illiberal societies find it easier to resist the lure of pornography or of sugar. So I'm just not, I'm sold on the human problem, and I'm sold that we all need help in our lives. It helps to live in communities that bolster and educate us in ways that help us learn to rule ourselves, our psyches, individually. But I'm just, on reflection, because I've changed, but on reflection, I'm just not so sure that the most important source of these problems is this structure of society. I would say. I think these are human problems. There were other parts to your question, but I've gotten lost in that thought at the moment.
Well, I mean, that in a way addresses maybe my central concern, or what I consider to be not, well, so there was this idea that we become apolitical.
Oh, yes. No, that's important. That's important. Well, look, I guess what I hope in articulating this understanding of the positive, noble value, or one of them, of the liberal offer of refuge is that, I mean, this should be the sort of thing that mobilizes people and that we can gather around, that feels worth the sacrificing for and defending. And that, so we would have to talk about exactly what you meant by tyrannical as the danger, but if what you mean is that a tyrant eliminates the spaces of refuge in society, then there would be a liberal reason to oppose that. And so I think there could be and in fact, I would say liberal societies have been quite able to mobilize for war and to do well in that way. So again, I'd have to see evidence that they weren't able to do that.
I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for because our next session is in 15 minutes. But please carry on the conversation if you'd like. Address your questions to Dr. Garsten afterward, and join me in thanking Dr. Garsten with a warm round of applause. Thanks.